Hi, third grade, Detectives in Togas, Chapter 5. So after we do this chapter, you can read along with me. You're going to write in your notebook 3 very good sentences, a summary, and then I'm going to collect those notebooks somewhere along the way at the end and read them. So don't get behind. Right after you listen, you should write it because it's fresh in your mind, okay? This is called Claudia. "Rufus did that," Julius exclaimed. "He must have gone off his head," said Publius. "If Caius's father sees it, there will be trouble." The boys threw anxious glances at the senator's house. Vinicius took the worship of the gods very seriously and was a great admirer of the emperor. It was common knowledge that he had donated a great deal of money for the building of the temple of Minerva. "Is it bad to deface a temple?" Flavius asked. "Is it bad?" Publius replied. "You can get in real trouble that way." Antonius went up to the temple wall and dabbed his finger in the sea of Caius. "I wonder where Rufus got the red paint," he said with admiration. Mucius pushed him aside and tried wiping off the writing with the hem of his toga. But the paint was already dry. "Too bad," he said. "This scribble has to be erased." "Maybe we can rub it off with a stone," Julius suggested. He looked around, but there were no stones in sight. The ground in front of the temple was kept extremely neat and clean. "Let's use our styluses," Antonius said, but it was too late. 2 men were walking quickly toward the temple. Flavius instantly snatched up his school equipment and fled, toga streaming behind him. He ran across the square and hid behind a dense hedge of oleander shrubs at the edge of the woods. The others did not hesitate for long and followed his example. Why did you run?" Antonius asked, panting. "Those men might think I did it," Flavius replied. "Quiet," Mucius whispered sharply. "They can hear us." The boys peered through the branches and saw the men disappearing behind the temple. One of them called out, laughing, "Take a look at that, Claudius. Somebody has written 'Caius is a dumbbell' on the temple wall." The other man did not seem to see the joke. "Scandalous," he growled. "An outrageous crime. Nothing to laugh at." "Well, now, take it easy," the first man could be heard saying. "You can see it's a child's handwriting. Some silly kid's trick, that's all. You and I were once young, my dear Claudius." "No," protested the man addressed as Claudius. "Young or not, I would have known enough not to desecrate a temple." The 2 men emerged from behind the building and walked toward the stone staircase, which led to the narrow alley. There were 2 elderly citizens in snow-white togas. One of them was a big, tall man. The other was short and spindly. The large man waved his arms in excitement and anger as he talked. Abruptly, he stood still, grasped the thin man by the toga and shouted, "And I tell you, this isn't just a schoolboy prank. The temple is dedicated to the emperor. This is an act of criminal blasphemy. The boy ought to have both his hands cut off. Both hands! And that would be far too mild a punishment." The thin man looked uncomfortable. Yes, you're right," he said, trying to pacify the other. "But it's none of our affair. We must get to our shops. We have a great deal to do today." They moved on and started down the steps. First their legs vanished, then their hips, and then their heads. For a moment, the bald head of the big man glistened in the morning sunlight. Then it, too, disappeared. The boys looked at one another in consternation. "Do you hear that?" Antonius said. "He wants to have Rufus's hands chopped off." "I told you it would lead to trouble," Publius said self-importantly. "But nobody knows that Rufus did it," Flavius said. "No matter, we have to get rid of that writing," Mucius said. He started pushing through the shrubbery, but Antonius held him back, whispering, "Somebody is coming." He pointed toward the home of Senator Vinicius. Adjoining the left wing of the villa was a high garden wall overgrown with wild grapevines. Where wall and house met, there was a tiny door which the boys saw was now slowly opening. A small girl thrust her head out and looked in all directions. "Claudia," Mucius said in surprise. "What is she doing?" Claudia was Caius's younger sister and well liked by his classmates. She was gay and friendly and not a bit stuck up, meaning happy. Okay, that's what that word really means. The boys used to let her play with them, but recently she had passed her 11th birthday, which spelled the end of her carefree childhood. All at once, she had been put under the care of several Greek governesses who trained her and taught her and did not allow her to leave the house unaccompanied. But now Claudia slipped out and made straight across the square to the shrubs where the boys were hiding. "Don't run away. I have something to tell you," she called out as she ran. She pushed aside the branches and faced the boys. "I saw you through the window. Something awful has happened. Where's Rufus?" "Home," Mucius said. "Oh, that's good." Claudia sounded greatly relieved. "But he'd better keep out of sight. My father knows all about it." She looked hot from her run, and her deep blue eyes were glowing with excitement. Usually Claudia was elegantly dressed, and her hair was done up with the greatest care, but this morning she had slipped quickly into a plain tunic, and her long brown curls were tied carelessly with a narrow ribbon. She wore house sandals, which probably belonged to her mother, for they were much too large for her. "What does your father know?" Mucius asked sharply, his eyes narrowing. "I'll tell you about it," Claudia replied, "but I'm afraid of being seen over here. I slipped away from my governess." "Come on," Mucius said. He took her hand and drew her along deeper into the pine woods. When they reached a pleasant mossy clearing, he stopped. "Have a seat," he said politely, pointing to a low flat rock. Claudia sat down, and the boys gathered around her. "Does your father know that Rufus wrote on the temple wall?" Julius asked. Claudia bobbed her head energetically. Tell us," the boys chorused. Flattered by being the center of attention, Claudia quickly patted her curls into place. "Our slaves discovered the writing when they came back from the market this morning," she began. "They told the secretary, who ran to my father right away. My father was at breakfast. He put down his glass of wine, left his bread and cheese, and rushed into the main hall to look out the window. When he saw the writing, he was furious. 'This is an outrageous desecration of the temple,' he shouted. 'Who did it?' The secretary couldn't say, so my father got angrier still and threatened, 'I will have you put in chains.' The secretary threw himself down at my father's feet, saying, 'Mercy, master. Perhaps your son Caius knows who it was. It must have been one of his schoolmates. Oh, I could have killed him for that.' The secretary is an idiot," Antonius declared. "Yes," Claudia said. "I never could stand him. My father sent for old Herodes, Caius's tutor, and ordered him to go to the school and fetch Caius. Old Herodes turned pale and said, 'Caius did not go to school today, master.' 'Why not?' my father roared at him. Shaking, old Herodes also threw himself down at my father's feet. 'Oh, master, don't punish me,' he pleaded. I waked Caius early this morning, but he locked himself in his room and refused to open the door. I knocked several times. Finally, he called out that there isn't any school today and that his teacher has gone on a journey.'" "What a fib," Flavius said. "What did your father do then?" Julius wanted to know. "He himself went to Caius's room and brought Caius back with him. Caius was still wearing his nightshirt and he looked real scared. Father is very strict with him. He led Caius to a window, pointed out the writing on the temple, and asked, 'Who did that?' At first, Caius just gaped, But suddenly he flared up and said, "Rufus, the son of Praetonius. Shame, shame, the boys cried out indignantly. What a traitor, Mucius said, frowning angrily. We must punish him, Julius said. Folding his arms, Mucius stood pondering for a moment. Then he announced, "We shall exile Caius. We won't be allowed to play, he won't be allowed to play with us, and none of us must talk with him." "For me, he doesn't exist," Antonius declared. "I won't speak of it either," Claudia said, blushing. "I won't speak to him either," Claudia said, blushing. She was obviously genuinely ashamed of her brother. "And I know he lied. Rufus is a nice boy. He wouldn't dab red paint on a holy temple. He gave me a beautiful ivory doll for my birthday." "But Rufus did do it," Mucius said. Claudia stared at him, her big eyes round in amazement. "Caius insulted Rufus's father," Mucius explained, "and they had a fight. This all happened in school. Rufus wrote 'Caius is a dumbbell' on a writing tablet yesterday," Julius added, "and hung the tablet on the wall," Flavia said. "So then Xantippus threw him out of school." Publius finished the tale. Claudia turned her head from one to the other with growing concern. "They threw him out of school?" she exclaimed. The boys knew she was very fond of Rufus, and Mucius hastened to reassure her. "It isn't so bad. Xantippus forgives him." Claudia's face lit up. "That's good," she said, but immediately she looked troubled again. "My father is awfully angry," she murmured. "I came out here because I thought Rufus was with you, and I wanted to warn him." "About what?" Mucius asked. "Well, it was this way," Claudia explained. "My father didn't believe Caius. That's why he sent for the 2 policemen who patrolled the square at night. He pointed out the writing on the temple wall and asked whether they knew anything about it. They were dumbfounded. 'We saw nothing of the kind last night,' one said. 'How is that?' my father asked. 'There was nothing written on the wall,' the policeman replied. 'We were sitting right by the wall of the temple for quite a while. We always have a little snack at night, just some bread and a few figs and a sip or 2 of wine. It was bright moonlight. We would certainly have seen the writing if it had been there at that time.' 'When was that?' my father asked. 'Shortly after the 5th hour of the night,' the policeman said. 'Did you observe anybody near the temple?' my father asked. 'Nobody at all, sir,' the policeman answered, and then we left. He asked whether he should report the defacing of the temple, but my father ordered him to say nothing about it. 'I'll look into this affair myself,' he said. 'Oh dear,' Flavius murmured. 'That sounds bad,' Mucius said with a worried expression. 'And then what happened?' Julius asked. 'Then the 2 policemen went away,' Claudia reported. 'Perhaps your father intends to punish Rufus himself,' Flavius suggested. Claudia shook her head regretfully. 'No,' she said, 'he has another plan. After the policeman left, he asked Caius, "How do you know Rufus did it?" And Caius answered, "We had a quarrel." "That's no proof," my father said, but Caius insisted on it. It was so Rufus, because it's his handwriting. I know his handwriting," he said. On hearing that, my father said, "Aha, that's enough. If it is his handwriting, then there can be no doubt that he did it. I shall go personally to the prefect of the city this noon and denounce Rufus for his malicious desecration of a temple." The boys were too shocked to speak. The prefect of the city was a man noted for his harsh and extreme sentences. "Do you think the prefect will do something terrible to Rufus?" Claudia asked unhappily. Mucius nodded soberly. "He has passed a death sentence on people just for laughing when the emperor and his retinue went by." "But Rufus is only a boy," Claudia cried out. "The prefect wouldn't have a young boy put to death." "Why not?" Antonius said. "Many children have been put to death. I once saw someone being executed. There were 3 boys no older than we are. They were loaded with heavy chains and thrown into the Tiber. They screamed and struggled in the water, and the soldiers laughed. I raced down to the river bank to try to save them, but by the time I got there, they had already drowned. Claudia stared aghast at him for a moment. Suddenly, she jumped up and sobbed, "You're lying!" And off she ran, plunging blindly through the shrubbery. Hair streaming behind her, she raced across the square toward the garden wall. Halfway there, she lost both sandals. She stooped quickly and picked them up, but instead of putting them on, she continued running barefoot. She slipped through the open garden door and slammed it shut behind her. "My, but she's in a hurry," Publius said. Mucius gave Antonius an angry look. "You shouldn't have told her that story," he said. Antonius was hurt. "But it's true," he said. "Such stories aren't for girls," Publius said. For a while they sat in silence, thinking. The rays of the morning sun streamed through the shrubbery. The sky was blue, birds chirped, and a breeze rushed in the tops of the pines. From the suburra, the low hum of awakened street life rose up to them. "Rufus must flee," Mucius said suddenly. "Where to?" Publius asked. Mucius had thought up a plan. "Listen," he whispered excitedly. We'll hide Rufus in our cave. Tonight we'll bring him slave clothes. We'll dress him up in those, and we'll take him down to the river. I know a place where he can swim across without being seen by the guards on the bridge. He will have to travel by night and hide by day until he reaches our country place. I'll give him a letter to Solus, our manager, asking him to take Rufus in as a slave, just pretending he's a slave, of course. Solus will do it. He's a real friend of mine. I will always help him with feeding the pigs and milking. The police will never look for Rufus out there in the country, and he can stay away until the whole affair blows over." "A wonderful plan," Julius said admiringly, and the others chimed in with praises of Mucius. But Mucius put an end to this quickly. "Come on," he said. "We must go see Rufus at once." They took a shortcut through the woods to a rocky parapet, up which they clambered to a quiet boulevard. Then they ran along a quiet, shady street until they came to a large, old-fashioned building with tiny window openings. This was General Pretonius's villa. Mucius knocked on the door. It was opened by a white-bearded slave who recognized the boys at once. "How is it you boys are not in school?" he asked with a kindly smile. "We have off for a few days," Mucius answered. "Our teacher has an injured leg." The old slave chuckled. "I suppose you're all heartbroken about that, eh?" he said, his eyes twinkling with merriment. "And what brings you here?" "We'd like to see Rufus. We have something important to tell him." The old man said. "I think Rufus isn't feeling well. Leastways, I haven't seen him yet this morning." But you look him up for yourselves. You know where his room is. Come in." "Not feeling well?" Mucius asked uneasily. The old slave shrugged. "Just a guess. At any rate, he did not feel like going to school today, or he would have been up long ago." They stepped into the vestibule, took off their sandals, and went on into the dimly lit, modestly furnished central hall. They knew their way around the house, for Rufus's mother, Livia, was hospitable and encouraged the boys to come and visit. The boys liked her very much. Rufus's room was small, dark, and windowless, lighted only by a transom over the door. Lifting the doorway curtain aside, the boys stepped in. Rufus, who was lying in bed, sat up in alarm. "What's the matter?" he asked in confusion. He drew up the blanket, for he was wearing no nightshirt. Oddly, his hair was soaking wet, as though he had just ducked his head into a tub of water. "What's up? Why are you looking so queer?" he asked his schoolmates. "You must run away," Mucius said. Rufus paled. "Run away? Why, what for?" he stammered. "Come now, you know," Publius said in a rather sour tone. "I don't know anything," Rufus murmured weakly. Antonius stepped toward him and whispered, "Your life is in danger, because of what you wrote on the temple wall. Rufus shook his head in sheer bewilderment. I wrote something on the temple wall? Are you all off your heads? What was it? What temple wall? Never mind lying, Julius said severely. You wrote Caius is a dumbbell on the wall of the temple of Minerva. Didn't you realize that that temple is dedicated to the emperor? Rufus looked around at his friends in utter perplexity. Suddenly he began grinning. You're just trying to play a trick on me. Ha! I won't bite. We didn't come here to joke, Mucius said angrily. This business is much too serious. Hurry up, get dressed, and come along. At this, Rufus lost his temper. Let me alone, he shouted. I swear I never wrote anything on any temple wall. It must have been someone else. Anyway, you don't believe me? That's just too bad. Write some sentences about this. So what happened? So we have a few mysteries in this book. We have a mystery of who burglarized Antipus's bedroom and took his mathematical books. And we don't know who wrote Caius is a dumbbell on the temple wall. Do you think it's Rufus, or do you think it's someone else?